Well, I was born in Ejido, a communal ranch called El Cambio, Torreon, Coahuila, Mexico. That's where my mother and her family lived, and I lived there till I was 7, at which time my father, who was born in the United States, decided to bring us to live in the States. So I migrated to the United States when I was in 1956. There's 7 of us. There's 6 siblings. The last 3 were born in the United States. And 3 of my sisters and myself were born in Mexico. I've always loved to learn, and I've loved to read. In the ranch where I lived, I have cousins who are about 2 years older than I am, and they started going to school, and I wanted to go to school too. Must have been, just shy of 5 years old. And I cried and I cried. So my grandmother went to the principal and said, please let her come. And they said, okay, she can come, nobody believing that I would stay. And so I started school very early because I loved it. I had completed the 3rd grade when my parents decided to bring us to the United States. And in fact, I thought I was the smartest mathematician because, math is a universal language. And so I understood the addition, subtraction, and of course I could read and write. I just did not know the English language. Well, first, it was interesting because when we came to the States, and my parents deliberately brought us over in the summer. I crossed the border in June of '56 so that we could start school in September. I didn't know a word of English. We settled in East LA. All of the kids looked like me, but very few spoke Spanish, because at that time you were punished if you spoke Spanish. And I couldn't understand why kids that looked like me didn't speak Spanish. And, I couldn't even buy milk. But, kids learn quickly, and I learned quickly. It was quite daunting, because at that time you didn't have transitional or bilingual education or any assistance. I was the only one that spoke Spanish, and you were expected to stay up with the class. And it was quite difficult. If it weren't for the fact that I had a teacher who took a special interest in me, I don't know if I would have caught up early enough to stay with my classmates. Well, it's one of those experiences where it was positive with negative overtones. And, the whole issue of racism comes into play. This teacher, who I remember very fondly, Mrs. Moore, would help me during lunch and after school. And she would say, you're not like them, you're different. And so because she perceived me to be different in her way, in a positive way, she spent the time with me and giving me those individual tutorials in order for me to kind of get into the groove and stay with my class and give me enough time to understand. In retrospect, it wasn't a very positive thing for the rest of the kids. We're all 100% Latino. It was in the heart of East Los Angeles. And so I couldn't understand it. I said, why am I different? I knew I was different. I was an immigrant. But, it was till I was older that I understood the ramifications of that. It was interesting because we came from a ranch, and my mother, 4 girls. I mean, we all wore those pinafores that my mother put on, and I had these long braids, with ribbons. And so all the kids, I dressed differently. For lunch I would take tacos or burritos instead of bologna sandwiches. And then, of course, I didn't speak the English language, and I became the teacher's pet. It was difficult, but as a kid, you kind of feel the pain every day, but was it lasting? No. Yes, but in a positive way. I come from an extraordinarily traditional Mexican family, but my traditional Mexican family is extraordinarily non-traditional. The first 4 of my parents' children are girls. And so we were brought up to think that we can do anything we wanted to do, but we had to follow social norms. But as far as, sort of, we could do anything. I mean, I would join my father for selling stuff. I would help him fix the car, the old cars he had. So we understood the social norm expectations, but we had no limits as to what we could be or what we wanted to be. In the summer, we had this sort of rhythm to life. We were urban. We lived in Los Angeles, but in the summer, my dad and my mom would take us to the San Joaquin Valley. We had an aunt who lived in Lamont because we were going to work in the fields to earn as much money as we could as a family, so then we could take that money and go visit our family in Mexico. So it was one of those things where we all had to work very hard, go out there in the fields, and then the reward was that we would go back home and visit our relatives. Yes, and once again, it's either, sort of a challenge or an opportunity. I mean, you name the fruit, I've picked it. You name the vegetables, I've picked it. Picking peaches, is one that stays in your mind because you're picking out there at 110, sort of temperature, and you have to wear long sleeves and tie up your shirts up to your neck because of the fuss. And when you start sweating, it itches like heck. Well, my parents are, very entrepreneurial. And my mother is exceedingly talented with crafts, knitting, crocheting, sewing, cooking. She's a phenomenal cook. And, we were poor and so struggling. And so my mother would make tamales on Friday and Saturday. Friday night, we would go sell them in the bars. And then on Saturday, we would drive to all of the mechanic shops, and sell them at the mechanic shops. So Dad and I were the sellers. And then and during the night, we were the cookers. Mom and I would cook a batch of tamales. No. One of the things about my family, which I think is really important and frame who we are as a family, we're extraordinarily close. We always did it together as a family. It was a family activity. No one, everybody according to their age and limitations, doing their part, and it was for the good of the family. So, it bonded us together, and to this day, we're still an extraordinarily close family, totally supportive of one another. Actually, I wanted to be a teacher, and I have my aunt, great aunt, was one of the early feminist principals in Mexico. I have lots of cousins who are teachers and nurses, etc. And so my, aspiration as a kid of the early 60s, there wasn't a lot of encouragement either. If you went to college at all, and as a Latina woman, poor Latina woman, that even was a stretch. So it was very limited. Well, my parents have always been our role models. My parents both are exceedingly bright. They're not educated. My father taught himself how to read and write. So they're not educated, but let me tell you, their faith in education, and from children we were told, the key for us would be to get an education. All of their children would get an education, and they would sacrifice just about anything. So to us, that was very important. I always knew I was going to go to college. The dreams were limited in that it was junior college, and Cal State LA, which was the state college closest to us, and staying at home and going to college while you're at home and being a teacher, my parents always expected that of us. And I had a wonderful professor at junior college, Dr. Helen Bailey, who to this day, is one of my inspirations. This was one of those, ahead of her time women. She was the head of the history department, and I love history. My parents, my father loves history. And so when I met her and she encouraged me to sort of move beyond my limited dreams, I wanted to then get a PhD and be a historian just like Helen. And so, you know, it was like, well, she teaches. I can be a teacher, but not at an elementary school. I want to be a professor at a college. Absolutely. And so looking beyond a bachelor's degree, I, you know, thinking about getting a PhD. I graduated from a community college and then transferred to UCLA. And wanted to be this, you know, professor, the first Latina Chicana history professor. And I was in the history department, and I was working on a program called Project Upward Bound, part of your work study program. And that project brings kids from inner city schools into the university level on Saturdays and during the summers. And I was a counselor. And it was during, you know, the sort of the late 60s when there were walkouts and demonstrations for better educational opportunity of Latino students. And my kids, some of my kids came from those schools where, you know, the movement began. And so some of them, you know, were detained, arrested for walking out, for demonstrating. And literally, one day, I remember in February, my kids did not show up, February of 1970. And I said, that's it. I'm going to become a lawyer and change the laws. That Monday, I walked across the campus to the law school. They told me, number one, the deadline's March, so you got to do it right away. And by the way, you got to take the LSAT, which is like in 3 weeks, whatever it was. I applied, I took the test, and by August of 1971, I was at the law school. I didn't know anyone who was a lawyer. I didn't know what lawyers did specifically. I knew that they were responsible for making change, and I saw the need, and so I went. You know, ignorance is bliss, actually. I went home, and I wanted to tell my dad, and by that time, I was in the Graduate School of Education getting my credentials. I had graduated with my bachelor's degree, and I was getting my credentials to be a teacher. And in fact, I had applied and got my temporary credentials to teach. And they were hoping that I would help them financially with all of the other kids coming down the pipe. So I remember one Saturday, you know, finally finding the courage, and so say, Daddy, to tell him. And this is a funny story, and I tell it often. My father had a brother who recently passed away, and my uncle was the perfect caricature for a male chauvinist, okay? Girls had their place, girls had their role, and, you know, the whole thing. And he came to visit my dad, and he wouldn't leave. And I needed to tell my dad, right? So I finally decided I had to tell my dad while my uncle was there. And he says to me, why do you want to go to law school? Girls cry. You will cry when you go to court. And it got me so angry. You know, I was so upset, but respectful. So my daddy, you know, my father's point of view was, if that's what you want, then we'll find a way. Well, I graduated from law school, passed the bar, and the first person to seek my legal services, my uncle. And he was the one that was crying. It was not I. So, you know, my dad is, like I said, an interesting fellow and influenced our life tremendously. He would read to us and tell us the history of Mexico and every single president. From the time we crossed the border, we always observed my father voting. To him was really important. Listening to the news was very important. He could tell you who was running. To this day, he will tell you. You know, and he would say to me, how are we doing? You know, our candidate, you know, what's happening? You know, because he'll watch the news. So, you know, I began sort of kind of in high school, but really sort of got totally fully involved in community college. I got involved with the Latino ethnic groups organizations and recruiting other students. I got involved in the governance. So I was active in the civic life of the organization community-wise. Partisan to the degree that we had a political affiliation, but not sort of, you know, in there. It was more like the student movement and, you know, and women's rights. I was on the admissions committee. If actually you talk to the deans that were in the law school when I was there, they remember me very fondly. It's interesting because you know, we all philosophically, politically are of one mind. And you know, there's a lot of children of my children and the children of my siblings. And one day they were having a conversation among the cousins. One cousin says to the other one, because he was dating this young lady with different political affiliations, and the other cousin says, now, you know that in this family you're born a Democrat and you die a Democrat. I'm an extraordinarily stubborn person, and the worst thing you can do is tell me I cannot do something. It's just my disposition. And I had this teacher in high school, and it was in 12th grade, and he asked us to write an essay about our aspirations for going to college. And I wrote my essay, and he had a habit, Mr. Woods, of doing happy faces and sad faces. And he put a sad face on my paper saying I was not college material. That's the closest thing that I can recall that really angered me and almost devastated me. But being stubborn, I said, I will show this fellow. And in fact, when I got my bachelor's degree, I went back and I said, Mr. Wood, and of course he didn't remember, but I said, Mr. Wood, I want you to know. I said, what you did to me, and I want to show you. And here it is. And, and I think I did it more for me, just to get it out of me, because it did affect me to the point where it hung on me, and it was there. And my sisters, I have 4 sisters who are teachers, and one of their theme is being very positive and encouraging of their students. And I think all of us, sort of came to that attitude from the experience that we had, because a little bit of encouragement goes such a long way. And negative criticism, not said in a positive way, constructive way, particularly with children, can be so devastating. Well, once again, I applied to UCLA without telling my parents, because of course they wanted me to go to the closest college so I would stay at home. So we went to I applied and I got in. And so once I got the admissions letter, I had to tell my parents. So I told my mother. And my mother said, oh my God, we really have to work your father. So for a month, there was nothing my father could not want that he did not get. He got treated like a king. Didn't know what hit him. But I finally had to tell him. And he said, why? A college is a college. Why do you have to go out there? Finally convinced him. When it was time for him to take me to UCLA to stay at the dorms, all the kids piled up in this old Chrysler. I had one tiny little suitcase, with a pair of pajamas and enough for a week because I was coming home. My father drove, and because we didn't know where UCLA was, we ended up on the beach. We had to come back. Then my father, this is 1969, okay? My father then insisted that I go to the resident and asked for my father to go and inspect the dorm to make sure that there were proper locks, that there were no boys on the floor, that there was going to be proper supervision. Mind you, I'm a junior. Most young people of that time were not going through me, right? I'm this poor kid out of East LA, and my father's insisting on inspecting the locks. Every week, every Friday, as soon as classes were over, I come home to East LA. And then, I would be driven, and I would take the bus, the 87 bus, when my father couldn't drive me to UCLA. And I ended up hating the food because it was so alien that I convinced my father to let me rent an apartment with a friend where I could cook my own dinner and my own meals, because I was just not eating the food. I've always, combined fun with life. I love to dance, so I would go dance and, Casa Escobar, at that time. I worked. I worked throughout college. But, I will tell you, I have fabulous, wonderful experiences of college, of working. To me, learning is a joy. Yes, it's hard work sometimes, but I've never saw it as a chore. Well, being at UCLA, I was sort of beyond the shock of, being so close and yet so far. East LA, even today, and West LA are two different worlds. But I had gone beyond that. What was interesting to me when I got to the law school, it was, of course, predominantly men. And that class, the class of 1971, was one of the first classes where there were a bit more women and a bit more people of color. In fact, we were very proud of that fact. But you were in a sea mostly of men, and very assertive. I mean, people who go into the law are not exactly, and they were out there to show that they were like So, for the first 3 weeks, I thought, oh my God, what have I done? These people are so smart. Oh my God, I'm out of my element. It took about a month for me to realize, number one, they didn't know what the heck they were talking about, that they were making fools of themselves, and they had no shame in making fools of themselves. So I figured, if what it takes to be a good lawyer is to make a fool of yourself, I'm going to be a damn good lawyer. So, it was like one of those things. Actually, there were two others. But interestingly enough, one of them claimed to be of Spanish royalty. So Francisca, wasn't in the crowd I hung up with. And there was another Latina, in fact, two others now that I recall. And to this day, we stay connected. You had to stick together. Some professors would infer that, and in fact, one particular professor, more because I was a minority than I was a woman. But yes, this professor made it very clear that, we shouldn't be there. Murray Schwartz at that time was the dean of the UCLA Law School, and we became very dear friends during the law school and stayed friends afterwards. And one day, a group of us took over his office, okay? Because we were demanding more admissions and on and on and on. And I remember him coming to me and saying, Antonia, you should know better than to be doing this. Yes, I was very active in law school. By being involved in wherever you are, it creates an environment where you meet some very interesting people who are trying to impact the lives of people of the day. And so I was very fortunate, to be involved in that process. I think it was more of an indirect assist in the sense that my involvement in the civil rights movement, my involvement in, organizing, gave me a lot more confidence in my ability to do things. It gave me access to people that I could talk to, and I think in a way allowed me to really enter the practice of law running rather than slowly getting into it. The first summer out of law school, I clerked at Maldiv. That was in 1972. My first experience in working with Maldiv in Los Angeles. Then between second and third year, I worked for CRLA in Santa Maria and worked with farm workers and worked on farm worker issues. And then once I graduated from law school, that's when I began my career with the Center for Law and Justice. I met my husband. He was an attorney in the Santa Maria office when I went to clerk there, and to this day he's my husband. It was interesting because they gave you a great deal of latitude. I had my own caseload. I was able to develop my own caseload and to, in fact, to this day, remember the cases where I represented people in administrative hearings on Social Security, on workers' comp, where human resource is so sparse, you're giving a lot more responsibility. So in the 3 months, I did a lot and I learned a great deal. Met Cesar Chavez, got to get very involved in the sort of movement of organizing farm workers. And as an urban student, was able to see the rural side of the civil rights movement. Strawberries, broccoli, it was almost all rural. I wanted to stay in Los Angeles. I'm basically, it's hard to say, but realized I'm a very urban type of person. I like, sort of the bustle an urban place. And I wanted to still pursue the issue of civil rights litigation in an urban setting, and that's why I went to the Center for Law and Justice. Oh, it was fabulous. It was in the heart of East LA. And actually it was interesting because it was a community in transition. It had been predominantly Jewish at that time. And then it was transitioning into Latino, but it was East LA. In that time, it was funded by the War on Poverty, from Washington, D.C. And at that time, there were no limitations. So our offices could do criminal, could do civil, can do civil rights litigation. So I had, the best of all worlds. I was able to take on criminal cases. I was able to do civil cases, civil litigation, and of course that's where I began the litigation of the sterilization case. So my first 3 years of law school, I must have packed in at least 8 years. No, I never thought about working in a firm, and it's a good thing, because in reality those opportunities were not open to minorities when I graduated. There were very few. I think that of the Latinos that graduated when I did, if 2 or 3 went into the law firm, that was a lot. Those opportunities were not there. I've always wanted to be sort of a civil rights lawyer and use the law to change, although I will tell you that working in government is also a public interest lawyer. My definition of public interest is very broad. It's like everything else. I arrived in model cities, and literally, I must have been within 3 months. Even before November, when I passed the bar, this doctor came to the center, who was working at LAU at the county hospital, and he came with, I remember, a box of files, and he wanted to talk, even talking to people, because he said that there was a lot of Latina women that were being forcibly sterilized without their permission. And so the case was given to a more experienced attorney, Charlie Navarrete, Georgina, and myself. And literally, we began investigating, and I must have driven up and down LA. I've interviewed over 100 women who were forcibly sterilized. We filed on behalf of 13 because the statute of limitation had run on the others. And Georgina left the center. Charlie is blind and was partially blind at that time. So here I was with Charlie, the blind and the ignorant, litigating this extraordinarily complicated civil rights case. And in fact, that's how I got involved in the women's rights movement, because at that time the women's rights movement was in full force, and the issue of choice was very much, whether it was sterilization, whether it's abortion rights, all those issues were into play. So I came into contact with the leadership of the women's rights movement. I lost the case. It was tried, but we lost the battle, but we won the war. As a consequence of that litigation, we advocated for and were able to obtain waiting periods that no woman giving birth could sign to be sterilized. That there had to be a 24-hour waiting period. That women going through cesarean section had to be given a waiting period in order to for them to give their consent. So in that sense, to this day, you have waiting periods in order to be sterilized, and it cannot be done in conjunction, if you have not signed before, with childbirth. State rules and federal rules, federal regulations and state regulations, because you also have to keep in mind that my case in the west coast of LA was also happening at the same time with the sterilization of those poor African American girls in the South, and they were sterilized because alleged mental incapacity. So it was sort of the ferment of all of those issues that we were able to get the regulations both at the state level and at the federal level. I was approached by the Legal Aid Foundation to head one of their offices. And so I moved from the model cities to the Lincoln Heights Legal Aid to head that office. Three years. And so I went to head an office. In fact, I was supposedly directing attorneys who had 20, 25 years. And then I was there for less than 2 years. And then that's when I was approached by the Kennedy folks about working with the Senate. Ignorance, like I said, is bliss, but it's also very limiting. I had no idea what counsel to the Senate Judiciary was. I mean, it was outside the realm of my experience. This is 1977. And so, Jimmy Carter won in 1976. And Gloria Molina, who's now a county supervisor in Los Angeles, worked for the Carter campaign. And after the Carter won, she went to work for the White House personnel, as a young woman. And so she kept calling us, for jobs. I had just gotten married, and I said, I'm as happy as can be with my job. I'm here. So one day she calls up and she goes, I got a job that you might be interested in. And it was counsel to the Senate Judiciary. Senator Edward Kennedy had taken over the Judiciary Committee from Eastland, and he was, hiring individuals for the positions. I said no, that I wouldn't go. So then she called up and she says, okay, an attorney who works for the Judiciary Committee is going to be in LA. Would you at least talk to him? So I had a wonderful conversation with this fellow, right? Forgot about it, and whatever. So then I get a call that the senator wants to see me in Washington, D.C. I didn't want to go. I didn't know what counsel was. I had no idea. I was happy where I was. My husband said, Antonia, people are salivating for this position. You don't know what a privilege. Just go through the process. So I finally agreed to go to Washington, and the day before, they canceled. Because David Boyce, who at that time was chief counsel to the Senate Judiciary, was coming to Palm Springs to talk to the Ninth Circuit. And so my job was to go now and meet with David Boyce. So I went and bought an interview suit, because I was a hippie lawyer. So I went to Palm Springs, and I met him at the coffee shop before he gave his speech. And we had the most lovely conversations. He never asked me about my qualifications. He never asked me anything. We had fabulous conversation. He went on to give his speech. I came back. The next Monday, I get the job offer. I said, no. He thought I was a fool. So my husband literally said, Antonia, you don't know. This is the most unbelievable experience. You'll be exposed to a different world. I mean, and then I went to my dad and my mom. My mother says, no, you just got married. You got to focus on your marriage. You've been running around, footloose for long enough. You got to do the family. Went to my father. My father says, if your husband is willing to go along and he's okay with it, go with it. Go for it. He just said, I'll leave my job. I'll go with you. You're a fool. This is a one-time life opportunity, and you're going. It was January. Remember, it was very cold. I had never worn closed-in shoes. I had no coat. We arrived in D.C., took the red-eye Friday night. We arrived Saturday. It was one of the major storms. Woke up at 3 o'clock, ran to Saks Fifth Avenue in D.C., the one that's right off wherever, Friendship Heights in D.C. I bought a coat, closed-in shoes, a jacket, and a suit for the next Monday, and I went to work. He found work, and I kept telling him, honey, you're highly qualified, you're an excellent lawyer, and sure enough, he found work in the Justice Department, and in fact, worked there for many years until we came back home. Professionally, Senator Kennedy has a reputation for a lot of things, but one of the reputations that he has is hiring some of the best and the brightest and most interesting people. I think, to me, as I look back in retrospect, it was one of the most fascinating experiences. I got to work with David Boyce as my boss. Stephen Breyer was my boss. Ron Brown was my boss. My colleagues were extraordinarily talented, competitive, and I really was able to test my abilities with the best and the brightest. It just, sort of exposed me to a world that very few Latinos then and even now are able to experience. It gave me an opportunity to compete and to expand my vision of the law and how I could use the law to basic to my goal of improving the quality of life for people and for Latinos. With Jerry Tinker, my colleague, and I, we're responsible in the Senate side for the passage of the Refugee Act of 1980. I mean, here it is, a 30-year-old person, having the influence, to draft legislation and to help, make it law. So whereas before I was, going into court seeking to have laws interpreted, here I was actually drafting the laws. And it was exhilarating. I worked on judicial nominations. I worked on some of the judges, that are on the Ninth Circuit to this day. I was able to work on civil rights cases. I was able to work on Latino cases and advise the senator on Latino issues and how my community saw certain issues. So in the limited time that I was there, I thought that there were two of the most formative years because, of course, in 1980, the Democrats lost control of the Senate and I lost my job. And that's when I moved to Maldives at that time. Well, two things. One, I was very pregnant with the first kid. And the other thing, too, is when we lost control, when the Democrats lost control of the Senate and I lost my job, Senator Kennedy was extraordinarily accommodating to all of us. And he offered to assist us in whatever shape or form, and thought that there was a lot of possibilities for me to stay in Washington and worked, in a firm with labor and an agency. He felt that wherever I went, I was going to do civil rights, but from a different perspective. My goal in going to law school was always to work in civil rights and to do civil rights litigation and advocacy. So when the then president of Maldives offered me the job to run the DC office of Maldives, it just seemed like a natural thing for me. One, I was returning to articulating issues on behalf of my community, the Latino community. I was working with a Latino organization in Washington, and now I would be using the skills that I had gained while working in the Senate to now do another part of the law, and that is to impact and affect and influence how laws were made, because then I would be a lobbyist for Maldives and advocating issues on that one. So gave me an opportunity to see the law from another different vantage point. And that was so useful because so few Latinos at that time not only had connections to the political arena, but Washington is connections to the media. Is sort of the people who sort of frame the issues. And to this day, some of the reporters, are still my best friends because I got to know them there. I got to, for the first time, get to know philanthropy from this part of the world. At that time, it was very rare to know the Rockefellers or the Fords or the Carnegie Foundations. So it just gave me sort of a view of the East Coast, sort of kind of the way the East Coast sees the world and the power structure there. And it's very unique for West Coasters at that time from my community to be part of that world and to be able to navigate that world. One can fight certain stereotypes and expectations of you, or one can go with the flow. A Latina, a woman, an immigrant coming from East LA, you sort of are expected, okay, to sort of kind of be typecast in doing that. But as I look back, I did have something to bring of value. I am a Latina, I am an immigrant, I have experienced the immigrant experience, so I thought that I had something of value to bring. I also am a firm believer particularly, in study of the law, that it's immigrants that make this country great. And that, America has always had this sort of kind of schizophrenic view of immigration. And that is that we are a country of immigrants, and yet our history of our treatment of immigrants has not always been, as kind. And in fact, it was because of the sending back deportation of Mexicans during the Depression that my father ended up growing up in Mexico. He was born in Texas. He lived in Texas. So in many ways, I kind of put that together, and I felt that I had something to bring to the table on that issue that was heartfelt. And so, if there's any issue that is associated with me, it's the immigration issue. When I had my first child, my mother-in-law retired as a teacher, relocated to Washington, D.C., and took care of my child. My mother-in-law and someone who came in to help, but my mother-in-law said that no stranger was going to take care of the firstborn. It was the first grandchild in the Stern side of the family, and of course it was the second coming. It was a boy. So, she came, and I'm eternally grateful for her. And when I had the second one, I realized that if I wanted to continue doing what I was doing, I had to come home so that my family would be the support system. So difficult choices, came home to the roots because family was important. It's like Hillary Clinton said, it takes a village to raise a child. And, we wanted our children to be surrounded by family, to be surrounded by grandparents, by cousins, by aunts and uncles, and they were all here. And since we made the choice of having children, then we had to make the difficult choice. This is where they were going to be. And our commitment is, once we came to LA, until our kids graduated from high school, we were not moving from Los Angeles, because they were going to have a stable home like we had a stable home, in a stable community across the street from their grandpa and grandma, across the street from their aunts and uncles. And I think, if I look back and people ask me what's the strongest influence, as I stated earlier, we did everything together as a family. And I think that in many ways I know is what made who I am. And I cannot replicate that. But to the degree that I can create that, or try to create that same environment, that's what I did with my children. When I started MALDEF, I had no idea that I had found home, in the sense of a comfort level of where the needs of the institution so well meshed my aspirations and what I wanted to do. I was hired by Vilma Martinez to head the DC office, and from 1981 till when I left towards the end of 1983, the immigration debate was raging. And so it was a confluence of things. The issue was very much in the public domain. I had worked on that issue in the Senate, and I brought that to the table. Interestingly enough, the most important thing, in my view, that I did for MALDEF during those years was the passage of the Voting Rights Act. There were three issues actually that happened there. Number one, it was we needed to renew the Voting Rights Act. Secondly, the Civil Rights Act of 1983 passed at that time, which was really important. And those two issues were extremely important because it was done through a broad coalition, and it brought me in close contact with the civil rights organizations and leadership of the time. Ben Hooks from the NAACP, Jack Greenberg and Julius Chamber from the Legal Defense Fund, Wade Henderson, just all of the people were at that time working there, Judy Lickman, all those people. So it was one of those things in the civil rights movement where the different ethnic and gender groups got together, and it was during the Republican President Reagan's administration that we worked on that. So that was really important as far as accomplishments, but it was the issue of immigration that was paramount as far as what was going on, the Simpson-Masoli's and the different variations of that. That was one of my tasks that was given to me, to articulate our issues and concerns. In late 1983, we decided to come home because I had my second child. And as I indicated, we realized family comes first for us always, that I could not continue doing that. And we did not want to raise our children in D.C. away from our family. So I literally left MALDEF, quit MALDEF, to come home. At that time, MALDEF said, no, you stay with us. You work out of the LA office. So when I returned as the director of the employment project. And my first task was to articulate a strategy for opening employment opportunities for Latinos. And it was, for the short time that I was there, it was the articulation of litigation strategy to sue the grocery chain stores, because they were jobs that paid well, were unionized, and did not require a college education. And so, it was Safeways, Ralph's, Lucky's, Albertsons, you name it. But that was what I started to do when I came back. Shortly thereafter, I was promoted to vice president, to sort of help with the administration. Well, as you know, once you get a title of vice president, you become a paper shuffler. It's administration, the governance, the fundraising, the developing of strategy. And so for me, unfortunately, I wasn't able to really get knee-deep in litigation. I've always loved litigation. I mean, one of my regrets is I never honed in the skill really well, because I never did it long enough. After I was made vice president, the opportunity opened up to be the president general counsel. And actually, the opportunity had come up before, and I had chosen not to apply. I didn't want it. I was not interested. Second time around, I applied, and I got the job, 1985. And the first 2 years were extraordinarily turbulent for a whole variety of reasons. One, funding. Two, two leadership transitions within 3 years. And, the sense that to some, I wasn't perceived as high-profile enough. And so, as is very well known, the executive committee tried to fire me, and it was a very public fight. It was in the front page of the LA Times, and made it to the New York Times. And I sued the executive committee, alleging that they did not have the authority to fire me, that only the full board could fire me. It was a very hard fight, because they had already hired a former governor of New Mexico to take my position. It was, it's one of those ugly, family fights that, was very public. But at the end of the day, I prevailed. And, it was a 23-year love affair with MALDEF. I was there for that long. MALDEF at that time was headquartered in San Francisco. When I was hired, it was headed by Vilma Martinez, another pioneer, a Latina pioneer in the legal profession. And it had offices in Washington, D.C. It had offices in San Antonio, where it was born, and in Chicago. It also had an office in Colorado, in Los Angeles. The issue of me being a woman, it wasn't really the issue, because Vilma had been the president for 9 years. So that it wasn't entirely a gender issue. I think what happened was that the sense of, in organizations, nonprofit organizations, sometimes the alliance between the chair and the president are not really there. And one of the things I learned from that process is the exercise of power. I've never been uncomfortable with exercising power. And in fact, if you don't have power, you cannot effectuate change. And it's one of the things I tell women all the time, and particularly young women. And I say power is neither good or bad, it's how you use it. And you cannot make change if you don't have the power and if you're not in a position to do that. So you have to aspire for that. But hopefully, as women, and also men, you know, we have a more noble sense of the use of power. I had a very clear sense of where I wanted to take Maldives. I wanted it to be much more activist. I wanted to be involved much more in community advocacy and in public policy advocacy. I wanted a much stronger sense of litigation. And so, you know, there were some differences. So I think that the gender issue came in later in the battle. It was basically a difference of opinions. It turned into a gender issue, and the mistake that some of the members in the executive committee made was thinking that I was going to go away nicely. If they had asked me nicely to resign for the good of the community, I probably would have done it. But they tried to exercise raw power, and that's when, you know, I wouldn't have it. No. It was just going through the process. Darn it, they weren't going to treat me that way. And I, you know, and for me, I don't mind losing. And I'm a good loser. But I'm going to fight, or I'm going to, you know, give it my best. And then if I don't win, I know I tried. And so that was the thing. And my husband said, you cannot walk away. You're not a loser. You're a fighter. And once you fight, and if you lose, fine. Because I was saying, why the heck do I need it? I have a whole bunch of options. But in retrospect, it taught me a lot about that I am a very determined person, that I'm not afraid, you know, to use power, and that I'm a pretty good strategist. It did become, in many ways, what I articulated. You know, for the first time, we created parent leadership training programs. My whole philosophy is that litigation is a tool, but that tool has to be accompanied by a whole bunch of other activity. You know, like for instance, we can win a case, but it's just a piece of paper. If the community's not organized to fight for that, you know, whatever we want to be implemented, it's just a piece of paper. So to me, it was being much more holistic. As lawyers, we use the tool of the law. I also, you know, opened an office in Atlanta, Georgia, reflecting the growth of the Latino community in Atlanta, Georgia. I strengthened the presence in Springfield, Illinois, in Austin, Texas, in Sacramento, California, and of course we always had an office in Washington, D.C., because I thought public policy was another tool that went hand in hand with litigation and community education. And I called it the three-legged stool approach. Every person who leads an organization leaves his or her imprint. I know that being there for 23 years, 18 years as its president, general counsel, that I shaped that agenda. I see issues, you know, from my lens, and my lens is that I'm a woman and I'm a Latina. One cannot, and a mother and a daughter, those experiences of our lives affect how we look at the world and how we view the world. And I think, you know, that, you know, I tell people, you know, women aren't any better or any worse, but we do see the world differently, be shaped by the experiences that we have, and we have to recognize and not be afraid of it. When I got there, there was a Chicana Rights Project. Well, at that moment, you know, it was defunded. Well, to me, that was not the end of women's issues. They were integrated into everything we did, because how could you represent the Latino community if you didn't incorporate 50% of the population of the Latino community? So to me, being a woman and a Latina affects everything I do. In many ways, I'm a contradiction in many ways, and I acknowledge that. I'm a devout Catholic. I go to church every Sunday, and I'm very much pro-choice. I believe that a woman should have the right to choose, and we as women face the consequence of the choices that we made with our Maker. So to me is I will face the consequence of my decisions when I meet my Maker. I don't know what I would have done as a woman if I had to face difficult choices, but I know that I would have wanted the choice, to make that choice. So when I got to MALDEF, a lot of wonderful male board members who I adore, of the old school and with a different perspective. And I wanted to be on the pleadings that went to the Supreme Court dealing with the issue of choice. And so I had to go to my board. And once again, I articulated the legal position. I articulated how, and I said, look, myth, perception, and reality. Perception that Latinos are Catholic and we only think one way. Myth that Latina women don't have abortions. Reality, a very large percentage, overwhelming percentage have abortions, and it's not choice. It's not economic necessity. Those are the facts of our community. So if I cannot represent those facts, how can I say I'm representing the community? Well, after a very long and lengthy board meeting, I remember one board member told me, okay, Antonia, we'll let you do it. But if it's any backlash, it's your tushy that's on the line. I said, so be it. I'll take the fall. To this day, we're still on those briefs. Well, actually, I think that the same issues, and maybe even worse today, the public debate on immigration and immigrants, the increasing class economic inequality. We don't talk about race as much, but if you look at poverty, if you look at a lot of the social ills, they're still painted with race and ethnicity, education, health, economic opportunities, and as our economy transforms into a global economy, our middle class is hurting, and the debate and our elected officials are not helping us navigate this dialogue in a constructive way. Instead, it's being a very divisive, as if a gain of one is at the expense of the other. And I really feel that it's hurting America. Demographically, it's a fact of life that the United States is going to be a very diverse community. The numbers are here, age-wise, gender-wise, ethnic-wise. We need to begin to debate and discuss the challenges of being a very diverse country, and to really raise the question of what is it to be an American? I used to have a speech that I would give when I say, the day that you look at me and see an American is the day that I think we will have made great progress. And you don't ask me where I'm from because you assume that I'm an immigrant. And you need to look at me and say, yeah, because of values, common values, our perception of what it is to be part of the civic life of this country and what makes us as Americans, that's what has to unite us, and we haven't had that conversation. Well, an opportunity came up, and I see MALDEF as a vehicle for social change. CCF, the California Community Foundation, is another vehicle for social change. At MALDEF, we dealt with the macro, the systemic change. CCF offered me an opportunity to apply the macro at the local level, to concentrate on a geographic area. Mind you, LA County, 10 million is not exactly small, but to apply it, to have resources and to use those resources strategically. Yes. And it's also interesting once again, because I have come to realize that my experience has allowed me to hone in a whole bunch of other set of experiences and skill sets. I've learned that I can manage and direct an institution in a certain direction. And being at CCF, that's what I've been able to do. It also has allowed me to get outside the perception of being ethnic-based. The California Community Foundation is about all Angelinos, and for people to begin to see me in a different light. You know, yes, I'm Latina, yes, I'm former President General Counsel of Maldives, but they've expanded their perception of me and not typecast me as I had been in the past. It's interesting because I always, not as much as I thought as I would, I always saw myself as representing a specific interest, the Latino community, but within the realm of the society, as a part of society. You know, and it was not to the exclusion of other issues or other representations. So that hasn't been a challenge. What has been interesting to me, and it's not really been a challenge, since I've been at the California Community Foundation, you know, we more than doubled our corpus. And that has enabled us to really sort of be much more active. We've adopted a 10-year plan. I've incorporated the advocacy part to CCF. I've also incorporated specific strategies to focus on certain communities in which we are trying to be holistic, and that is attack a community from different vantage points: education, health, community social services, public safety. How do you maintain a healthy working class community? You know, how do you engage those members of those working class communities to be engaged in the life of that community? And it's been very interesting and very exciting. You know, there are, I believe, 86 cities in LA County. We picked El Monte, California, which is quite a good-sized city. You know, it's 15 minutes from downtown Los Angeles. We're going to be working that. Also created a new department, the Department of Civic Engagement, because it's not all about money. It's about bringing people together to talk about an issue, to come to consensus about what the issue is, to try to formulate options on how to solve that issue. The other thing that we're doing is partnership between the private sector, the public sector, and the non-for-profit sector, because I don't think any sector can solve a problem. It's together that we can solve a problem, and that's a new approach at CCF. So it has allowed me to be much more holistic, to look at issues from a more holistic approach and try to approach them from there. And it's nice to have resources. At Maldives, the struggle was always trying to raise the money. Here, we have the ability, you know, to grant out money to do all these wonderful things. For me, you know, I've been fortunate in my career as a woman, as a lawyer, to have seen so many different aspects of the law, to be able to play in so many different ways with the law, but always with the goal of using the law as a vehicle for positive social change. And I really do believe that that's what makes America so unique, that we are a country of laws, and as flawed as we may be in applying those laws, that we do have, through our legal system, the ability for positive change without a lot of violent disruption. And that's going to be a challenge in the years to come, but I still believe that my ability to play in that arena has been in large part because of the fact that I am a lawyer. Well, it's not only the gravitas, but you know, I tell people, when you go to law school, you're trained to think differently. I mean, as lawyers, what is our job? To solve problems, to connect the dots, to look at institutions, to look at issues and try to solve them. And I think it's that thinking process that allows us to sort of look at issues and do it. I also think that as women, we bring a very practical vantage point because of history and, you know, sort of the gender issues and what we've had to. We always have to navigate different worlds and bridge different worlds. And that's what it is. You find those commonalities that bridges life together. So, and it's the best professional liberal arts degree that you can have. To have aspirational goals, to look at the law is a noble profession, and to understand that you can accomplish so much. And I guess for me, the most important thing is people are basically good. People basically want to do the right thing. You just have to find the self-interest. And I've learned over and over again. I'm a very positive person.